All right, guys, this is going to be Chapter 27, The New Deal. This will be an overview of the chapter. Make sure you read it on your own. Between the two, you should get a pretty good idea with that and the JVLA deal. All right, here, part one, competing proposals. So FDR comes to power right at the beginning of the Great Depression. FDR is going to expand the government to its largest uh, at any point, or at this point in history, and also expand the powers of the executive to the largest at this point in history. Um, as it talks about how he assembles a brain trust, effectively he goes and gets the best and brightest to come help him find ways to end the problems of the Depression. Uh, some people, as it talks about in the notes and in the book, that they wanted, stricter antitrust laws. Other people wanted new government entitlement programs, um, and what ends up happening is it's a little bit of both. All right, he is going to have entitlement programs. He is going to sort of tweak the business model a little bit. Now, the ways he deals to approach uh, attempts to approach the depression problem with his New Deal stuff is one, he needs to relieve the banking system with some sort of monetary reform. Two, he's going to sort of straighten out this union deal, and he's going to support unions. And then lastly, he is going to uh, attempt to raise commodity prices by limiting their production. So when Roosevelt comes to office, he's going to have a Congress that is very pro-Democrat, so he's going to have help in passing most of these things. He's going to make good on two of his campaign promises. One, he's going to pass the Economy Act, which allows him to sort of reorganize some governmental stuff, namely the executive branch gets a lot more power to deal with the payment to veterans and workers. He's also going to end prohibition, all right, by passing the Beer Wine Revenue Act and eventually the 21st Amendment, which sort of allows uh, the production and sale of alcohol. One of the first things they'll talk about is the first 100 days that he has in office. Now you can see the list here of all the stuff that gets passed in that first 100 days. The mortgage acts and the housing administration and all that sort of stuff are kind of interesting because it's all about keeping people from losing their houses or their farms or whatever it is. Lastly, the one on there that's pretty interesting is the Federal Deposit Insurance Banking Act, which it creates the FDIC, which insures banks up to 5,000. Excuse me, personal insures banks for your personal deposits of up to $5,000. Realize that there had been runs on banks during the Depression. So people had run and taken out all of their money. Well, most of the banks didn't have it because they had loaned it out. So that caused the banks to go bankrupt, people not to have any money, so forth and so on. The system ground to a halt. So with these banking acts, they wanted people to have more faith in banks. And then with this Federal Deposit Insurance Act, people then would have their money insured. So if the bank did go under and they couldn't get it, that they would eventually get their money back. Relief measures, all right. Unlike Herbert Hoover, who found any sort of direct government involvement in sort of helping the unemployed or whatever as kind of against his mandate, Roosevelt went at it wholeheartedly. What he's going to do is pass a series of things: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Civil Works Administration. They're all going to be passed with this idea of putting people to work to build public things. So, like the Public Works Administration, which we'll see eventually, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, and all this sort of stuff. They're going to all work at providing stuff for the national government, like bridges and roads and sewers and whatever, um, that they needed to build anyway. And now people are going to be put to work to do it. Thus, have money in their pocket to spend in the economy and hopefully get it going again. So his second sort of step here in the New Deal slash 100 days was to help out the farm sector. So what they did was they passed laws that paid farmers not to produce to keep the demand high. the way they came up with the money was that they taxed the processors of this thing. So if you grew some sort of grain and there was a guy that milled it to turn it into flour, they taxed the guy that milled it to turn it into flour and then gave the money to the farmers. Yet again, the idea there was it would keep the amount low, farmers would have money in their pocket, and then eventually the prices of these things would go up. These commodities like the grain we were talking about. Also, to help sort of the lack of crops, there's going to be a major drought from 1932 to 1935, I believe. And this drought will cause the Dust Bowl, all right, which causes dust storms, farms to go out of business, and people to relocate. You can see in the map here the hardest places hit, and eventually we'll talk about this in a few slides as well. But what's going to happen is the Agricultural Adjustment Act or administration is going to be sued by these processors that we just talked about and found unconstitutional that they can't be taxed. The courts will uphold it. They'll get rid of it. They'll try to conserve soil by saying that these farmers shouldn't grow on it. They'll get paid not to grow on it. And that won't really work. And so eventually they go back to the original thing of paying the farmers not to grow stuff at all. And they'll just pay for it out of federal funds. Reviving industrial growth, as I mentioned a few slides ago, there's going to be the Public Works Administration to get people back to work, money in their pockets. It's going to be headed up by a retired Army General, Hugh S. Johnson. All right, it's the 2 points, as you can see right in here. All right, to stabilize the economy by reducing chaotic competition through implementation of industry-wide codes, and then 2, to generate more purchasing power for consumers by providing jobs. They're going to create power plants, dams, all that sort of stuff. Like the Hoover Dam out in Nevada, I believe, is an example of something created during the National Recovery Administration. The most famous sort of thing during this is going to be set up as the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley runs, I want to say, through like 6 states. And what they do is they set up dams and other stuff along the Tennessee River to provide electricity to this sort of backwoods part of the country that didn't have electricity. So it's a sort of twofold thing there. People got jobs, they provided a service by providing electricity. The social costs of the Depression, right? You had a lot of people out of work, you had a lot of people moving. So you had 9.5 million, as it says right there, unemployed. Petty theft soared. People stole all sorts of stuff. Good video on this would be, if you ever get a chance to watch Cinderella Man and the kid stealing the salami. Maybe I'll show that in class or something. But also, divorce rates dropped, strangely enough. Usually one of the main reasons for divorce is financial issues. And the reason they dropped, though, was because people couldn't afford lawyers to actually have legal divorces. So they often just left their partners, and men were known to sort of just go on the move to find another job, leaving their families behind. And then you'd eventually have these orphans and stuff like that. Your textbook refers to them as tramps and so forth. Back to the Dust Bowl migrants, as we pointed out earlier, you can see here in Oklahoma, Kansas, northern Texas, southern Nebraska, were the hardest hit from the Dust Bowl. And so you had 25 million acres of topsoil lost to this massive drought. Farmers were now unable to pay the loans and mortgages on their farms, so they just picked up shop and left. And you can see the routes they took here into California and into the northern Pacific up there in Washington and so forth. Some 800,000 people moved. Most of these people moved into urban California or into agricultural parts of California, like, say, the San Fernando Valley and stuff like that. One of the things FDR kind of gets a bad rap for initially is that he failed to address any sort of racism with the New Deal. And so even though the New Deal is going to be set up to help people, it's really going to leave out minorities. So due to the fact you had segregation, the separate but equal ideas set up by Plessy versus Ferguson, these New Deal things are going to really not help minorities. These mortgage relief and all this sort of stuff, banks aren't going to help out African Americans because they're going to see it as not beneficial to them, it won't give them sort of the helping hand that they need. You're also going to see problems for Hispanic Americans as well. Um, a lot of migrant workers during this time that legally came into the southwest United States to work on farms and stuff like that uh, couldn't seek federal relief because of either some sort of lack of identification, um, whatever. Uh, and so over 20, what does it say, 250,000 people in Texas alone are going to be deported back to Mexico and South America and stuff like that. Realize that, when times get tough like this, everybody sort of starts to pinch and worry about themselves, let alone not worry about other people. One of the more interesting things during this time period is going to be the civil rights decisions we're going to see. So this will start with the Scottsboro case. So the Scottsboro case dealt with a train traveling from Alabama to Memphis, Tennessee, and there along the road, many people hoboed or hitched a ride on the train. And somewhere along the line, a group of white boys jumped off and told the sheriff in Scottsboro, Alabama, that a group of black boys had attacked them. So the sheriff had the train stopped and the train searched. As they searched the train, two girls came forth and said they had been raped by the group of black guys. The black guys were rounded up and given hasty trials with all white juries, and supposedly there was like a posse to lynch them, all sorts of kind of bad things going on here. Um, Eventually, these get overturned. The Scottsboro Boys, as they're referred to, with the help of the NAACP and strangely enough the Communist Party, are going to come to their defense. And when they come to their defense, they're going to get them new trials. A couple of the things you'll see here: Powell versus Alabama, Norris versus Alabama. Powell versus Alabama in capital cases. It was common at the time in Alabama for a black man who had raped a white woman to get the death penalty. So it was a capital case, capital death penalty, that whole thing. In those cases, a lawyer was to be provided if you wanted one. We'll talk about Gideon v. Wainwright and down the road, but that wasn't always the case before that. Norris versus Alabama upheld the idea that you should get a jury of your peers, and so if you're a black guy, you shouldn't get an all-white jury. That was kind of the idea there. Now, in the end, it comes out that these two women had actually been prostituting themselves and were, basically having sex with anybody for money on the train, let alone all the black guys. So, in the end, you get justice for these guys on some level. And what ends up happening is you start to see the switch from African Americans being so heavily Republican since the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. Now they're starting to switch to the more progressive Democrats, especially in the South and stuff like that. Well, especially in the North too, I guess, to be honest. The New Deal matures. Vitality versus Hoover's aloofness. FDR was way more active, right? Even though he was, stricken with polio and in a wheelchair, all that sort of stuff, which was covered up at the time. He had his fireside chats, as mentioned already in your textbook. I know we haven't talked about it here, but he would address the country weekly on the radio, and it was like he was in your living room talking about the problems of the country with you. And so he was seen as a way more active, vibrant guy than, say, Herbert Hoover, who believed very laissez-faire about how everything should go, and he believed everything should be left alone. Yet again, FDR, way more progressive, way more active. Now, you're going to have people that are going to be critics of the New Deal and critics that the New Deal isn't enough, all right? And, politicians can't make everyone happy. In this section, you can read about Eleanor Roosevelt. She was like the first lady that was incredibly an incredibly public figure that took up her own sort of political stances on things and pushed issues. One of the strange little things was that FDR had an assistant that he had an affair with that eventually got to Eleanor Roosevelt, and after that, they never slept in the same room again. But they made a deal to stay together for these political purposes. So I always found that kind of interesting. There's a good 10 things you didn't know on the History Channel about the Roosevelts. I recommend it. Now, FDR's three major critics. The first one you can see there is the former governor and senator Huey P. Long of Louisiana. Long is going to basically say that the New Deal isn't doing enough, and he's going to start these share the wealth societies. Uh, he thinks he's going to be the share the wealth societies are this crackpot idea that they're going to take money from rich people and spread it around. Clearly, that's not going to work. Long, Townsend, they weren't really concerned about how any of the like economics of their plans were going to work, but they were popular, and Long really thought that he was going to have enough votes eventually to unseat FDR. Now, Francis Townsend's going to be from California, and he's going to see some old people rummaging through the trash, and that's going to inspire him to some sort of welfare-like reform plan. So the Townsend recovery plan would be for anybody, I want to say, over the age of 60. They would get paid $200 a month, right? That was a lot of money back in 1934. But the thing was, the critics pointed out that this plan would service 9% of the population and be the entire federal budget. So yet again, Townsend not concerned what was going on there. The last guy we got up here is Charles Coughlin, Father Charles Coughlin, the radio preacher. Coughlin called for uh, the free coinage of silver, much like we saw during the Progressive era with William Jennings Bryan. He's also going to come out and say that the New Deal is this communist plot and so forth and so on, and realize that all three of these guys really got their names for themselves because they appealed to the sort of marginalized people, the people down on their luck, that really just needed hope, and so they were willing to sort of latch on to anything, right? As we look in later chapters, and you think about the Germans from World War II, it's the same kind of thing. Now, the one thing that's going to happen is the Supreme Court is going to start to strike down some of these New Deal things for being a little overreaching. So as it says right there, the Supreme Court struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act because it thought that Congress had given too much power to the president. So the second New Deal, right? Uh, this is going to be the quote unquote must legislation that yet again Roosevelt still has a sort of help in Congress and so forth and so on. The quick version of this, the two major things: the Wagner Act, which is going to help with labor unions. It's going to set up the National Labor Board and basically keep companies from being able to affect or marginalize unions in their business. Then lastly, or actually probably more importantly, the cornerstone, as it says right there at the second New Deal, was the Social Security Act, okay, set up by the Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, right? This was important because it was the first time, or one of the first times we saw this government entitlement plan where people over the age of 65 received pensions, okay? I'd like to point out to you, you can see it right there in the notes, these pensions were weren't initially designed to be the sole type of income that you had. Right? They were designed to sort of help you out, all right, not for you to live off of. So today, people try to live off of their pensions, and that doesn't work. Roosevelt's second term, the election in 1936. Um, Huey Long is going to be killed by an assassin in Louisiana, somebody that he promised a job to, kind of thing. Uh, Roosevelt is going to crush the opposition. The Republicans elect Alfred Landon of Kansas, and FDR is going to win by the largest margin of victory in history. All right. He's also going to have a 3-1 majority in Congress, so he sees this as a ripe opportunity to really deal with the one group that has sort of been the thorn in his side in his New Deal, the Supreme Court. So you can't change the justices on the court, right? Because they're there for life. But there's no stipulation in the Constitution on how large the court can be. So he tries to enlarge the court, right? He tries to push this bill through. Okay, the problem is that this is going to step too far. And most people are going to be sort of outraged by FDR doing this, and so they're going to see him as yet again taking too much power and overstepping his mandate as the president. Now, by trying to increase the court, it was sort of, it was kind of a stupid thing anyway, because one of the judges is going to retire and he's going to get to replace him with somebody that's pro him, and all the stuff that he wanted to pass got passed anyway. So he really kind of made problems for himself by trying to expand the court and looking like he was trying to sort of create more power and be sort of dictatorial, like the word. So that's really going to be his biggest political blunder during this time. Now, towards the end of the 1930s, as we ramp up towards World War II, all right, the Democratic Party began to fragment. All right, you had Southern Democrats now that had a completely different mindset than urban Northern Democrats. Also in 1938, they lost seats in the House and the Senate, so they didn't carry that majority that they needed to pass all that legislation. As your textbook refers to it as a halfway revolution, uh, it did get a lot of stuff done, though. Okay, it increased the power of the federal government exponentially. It made the federal government what it is today. Um, it revived public confidence, was probably the most important thing coming, sort of trying to get through the Depression. People needed to be free to spend money and have faith that the money in the bank would be there. And then lastly, um, it was a switch, okay, from this idea of regulating things, like putting limits on stuff, like say from FDR, or not FDR, but Teddy Roosevelt, and the Gilded Age progressive stuff that we talked about, trying to deal with trust, to now sort of actively being involved to head off stuff, okay? So when we see some sort of depression type thing coming, or there's some sort of issue, uh, the president, through executive order or whatever, is now going to sort of actively try to eliminate these problems instead of sort of being that referee, or even, FDR, or I keep saying FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, where he would set regulations. It's now a step further for the role of the president, and he will manipulate and change things more than he ever has.